Radars, interceptors and space sensors. Donald Trump has revealed the Pentagon's new plan to take anti-missile systems into orbit to better deal with the threats of rogue states. The US president says the goal is to stop launches by hostile powers over their own territory, removing unnecessary risks.
We will recognize that space is a new warfighting domain, with the Space Force leading the way. It's ultimately going to be a very, very big part of our defense and obviously of our offense. We have some very bad players out there, and we're a good player, but we can be far worse than anybody if need be.
The strategy could see sensors flown into space to spot missiles being directed at the US during the initial launch phase. This means the Pentagon can engage aggressive actions at the stage when weapons are considered to be most vulnerable. Now, we're going to bring in a former US Congressman Ron Paul to discuss this further and give us some insight into this decision. Ron, Donald Trump, he's announced plans for a space-based missile defense system, allegedly in order to protect against so-called rogue states such as North Korea, Iran, Russia and China. Is there more to this plan, do you think, than just monitoring so-called threats?
Well, I think the biggest issue here is somebody's going to make a lot of money on it. You know, it reminds me of Star Wars a few years back that never really developed, but people got excited about it. And, you know, I'm all for having defensive weapons if necessary, but quite frankly, I can't quite see the danger that they're talking about, that we have to now go much further into debt on something that may take many, many years, and there's questions on how well it would work. But we're already running a $1 trillion debt every year, and this can't be paid for other than borrowing money. And I just don't see the danger that they're claiming. But there's a lot of support for it, especially the people who get to build this. This is a boondoggle for a lot of people. So I think the military-industrial complex is very, very powerful, very, very influential, and every congressman in the states here has some type of military operation. That is, they build weapons. So there's a interest in this, and the lobbying is very heavy, and frequently it goes along further than most people would guess that it should.
Ron, I mean, what's interesting about this is, you know, it's almost creating a third layer. Some might deem that an unnecessary layer of defense. Why, apart from the fact that they've said, you know, to monitor rogue nations, why do you think that this is a necessary system for the world? Because obviously if they start to create a space defense system, aren't other countries going to feel the need to do the same too? And we've already got nuclear weapons.
Yeah, and that sort of is what's been going on to some degree. It reminds me, of course, the Cold War. And, of course, one thing that annoyed me a bit, was afraid that we were moving in this direction, is when we in the West, the United States, didn't uphold their agreement that we wouldn't push NATO to the borders of Russia, and yet that has happened. So then when there's a retaliation for us getting too close, then we yell and scream. So it goes back and forth, and anytime there's an accusation, like, oh yeah, there's a weapon out there faster and more damaging, and we're not protected against these really, really fast missiles. I don't think we should ignore those kind of stories, but should you go to the point of committing to a program that is going to cost probably trillions of dollars, and then there's the question of it. You know, right now they're struggling in Congress to decide whether or not they can get $5 billion for a fence, and they're having some trouble there. But it seems like the money they spend in the military-industrial complex never gets the same scrutiny as some of these political issues do.
Yeah, I mean, if we could look again, the rogue states statement there, and they've mentioned, obviously, Iran, Russia, North Korea and China. How do you think those countries are going to react to this?
Well, I know how they would like to react, and that, of course, is, increasing their militarism that they have. But it can't keep going forever. Something obviously happens, but they're not going to stand by and ignore it. Every country, I think, thinks about their national defense. So often, though, these arguments get carried away, to the point where both sides are, upbetting the other side, building more and more. And the only people that seem to be really hurt from this are the people of the countries whose finances are drained. So every country, the people suffer. And that is why war is so bad, and we advocate a peaceful approach, because ultimately the people who fight and pay for all these conflicts, whether it's a Cold War or a hot war or whatever, it's the people who suffer. They suffer and die, and they suffer the consequences. And this whole idea, in the States, there's a lot of talk about military Keynesianism. Well, it's good for jobs, and people will make a lot of money and all. But when countries build, even though it's for defense, they think it's good for the economy, but it really isn't, because it's taken out of the economy. It's a negative. So when we build weapons, whether we put them up in the atmosphere, in the space, or we go to places where we probably have no business being, it's a distraction from that money being spent here at home. I think there has to be a better approach to peace, but rather than just saying we're going to have bigger and tougher weapons than you're going to have, and we can bankrupt you. And in a way, that was a big deal in the Cold War. That there was a lot of building of weapons, and our efforts here, I say, well, we've done pretty well in the States by doing this, but it's all based on debt. So
but Ron, if you look at the
people will say, well, we have to have them.
Ron, but if you look at the justification for this new step, we don't know how far it's going to go yet, because they're discussing it, but the justification is to maintain peace. What do you think about that?
Oh yeah, they always say the opposite of what they're doing. I think the main thing is that they're not sitting there and say, well, let's start a war. Let's provoke an antagonism that makes people fearful of a war. But I think the biggest motivator behind that, and they use the scapegoat, the countries that they might be able to stir up animosity toward. But I think it's more involved with money than anything else. I was in Washington for a good many years, and believe me, the militarists are very, very powerful and very, very influential, and they always get what they want. Even when you have the Republicans in, especially, they'll go more for the defense, but fiscal conservatives are big spenders as much as liberals. And of course, I've been involved a lot in the study of economics, and although on the surface and for short periods of time, that looks like it's a benefit, but ultimately it fails. And I think what you're talking about, using these scare tactics, that will motivate them to do something else, to be more antagonistic toward us, to say, oh, well, we're not past these. They have to answer to their people too. So if we're looking really tough and saying, don't mess with us, they have to do the same thing. Then it goes back and forth. For some reason, it's so unnecessary from my viewpoint, but that has gone on for a long, long time. And people think that, all we have to do is talk to the leadership. But the leadership of each country has to answer to their people. And for the people to go along with irrational spending, they have to be intimidated. See, we in the libertarian movement and in my Institute for Peace and Prosperity, we don't want to be involved, but there has to be a lot of scaring. We have to scare the people. If we don't do it, then you're not a good American, and you're not for peace, and this is good for jobs. So you have to go along with it, and that's an attitude that we try hard to change the attitude, because I do want to be very much involved in the world. I want to promote a philosophy of peace, but I think think it has to always be voluntarily. So other countries have used force and intimidation. The 20th century was a disaster, and I remember so much of that, yes, we do have some good qualities as a society, and I believe in spreading our ideas, but not through intimidation, not through wars, and not through threats. I think that does the opposite. And of course, we have a guide that I'd like to see followed more often. That is the guide of our Constitution, because that's the only thing that we can resort to try to rein in, an overly aggressive government.
Ron, you talking about, you mentioned that leaders, should be answering to their people, and if the international community are watching this rather confused, because we've seen an awful lot of contradictions, haven't we, in behaviour, and specifically North Korea has been mentioned as one of those rogue states, and but Washington has been praising improved ties. And we've seen this a lot, haven't we, where there have been successful meetings with leaders, and then something else comes along and a different strategy takes place. Does the Trump administration now, in your opinion, see things differently with North Korea?
Well, I like that when the stance is softened, and I encourage that when that happens, because we should have more of that. But the same way with Syria, our organization praised Trump when he said, "Well, let's get out of Syria. We don't need to be there. We said we were going to leave," and yet just look at how many people are coming down hard on him for merely mentioning, well, 2,000 troops were going to move around, and as if we've just created World War III by suggesting that we're not going to stay there. So it's usually done by scaring the people, but that's been around throughout all of history. In order for the people to go along with it, you'd say, why do the people go along with it? Why do young people in one country go thousands of miles to another country and start fighting each other? They don't. This is not a natural hate, but there's a natural animosity when the governments, the politicians, and the profiteers, they get involved, and then they get control of the propaganda. And this is true in just about any nation. The propaganda machine to support these views, very, very dangerous. And that's why I had always been hopeful that we could get our message out on the internet and try to explain to people that there's another option. There's such a thing as voluntarism, and work toward peace rather than threats and intimidation.
OK, we're going to leave it there, Ron. We could talk for ages, couldn't we? That was Ron Paul, former US Congressman. Thank you so much for coming onto the programme and airing your thoughts.